Hi everyone, welcome to our YouTube channel. Today we're going to be talking about the opioid epidemic and how the heck did we get here. We're in the midst of a horrible epidemic with opioid use and opioid overdoses. Someone said that if you don't remember the past, you're doomed to repeat it. And I think it's going to be interesting to learn how did we get here so that we can learn our lessons and not have to repeat it. If you're new to this channel, I'm Dr. Peter Coleman. And on this channel, we're going to be releasing videos every week that are going to be informative and help people get into recovery and stay in long-term recovery. Our channel combines medical evidence-based research combined with 35 years of practical patient experience. I've been treating patients with addiction for over 35 years. So if you find this channel useful and informative, please subscribe, tell your friends. You can see the subscribe button and share this information. So we're in the midst of a horrible opioid epidemic. There's at least 100 people dying every day. It's huge. In fact, there's more people dying every year than there were killed in the Vietnam War. I like to point out that if there were 100 people dying in an airplane crash in one day, it would be front page news. Everybody would be wondering what the heck happened. If it happened a second day, it would be stunning, and if it happened a third day, the airlines would be shut down, the airports would be shut down, and everything would stop until we got to the bottom of it. But the sad truth is that's what's happening every single day with the opioid epidemic. It turns out opioids, of course, come from the opium plant, and they've been around for thousands of years. In fact, there's evidence from ancient Egypt and China and Rome that people were using extracts of the poppy plant for their medicinal qualities. But there's not really much evidence that there was abuse going on, partly because people were taking it as a liquid, and when it goes through the mouth and through the stomach, it gets absorbed pretty slowly. So there really wasn't a lot of abuse. What started happening, there was morphine was synthesized, or actually extracted from the opium poppy in about 1800, and that made quite a difference. Now you had a drug that was much stronger and much purer, and so it became available. There's still not a whole lot of evidence that it was being abused until the hypodermic needle got invented around about 1850. There's a great book on the history of the opioid epidemic called Dreamland by Sam Quinones. And in that, he actually gives a piece of information that's kind of ironic and tragic. The guy that invented the hypodermic needle was married, and his wife used it and was actually the first person to die from an opioid overdose. So morphine was starting to be used through a needle, and it was very powerful, and it was used quite a lot in the American Civil War. In fact, it started becoming used so much that it was even called the soldier's disease at some point. So in the late 1800s and 1900s, these drugs were available over the counter. And so there were a lot of traveling salesmen and pharmacies. And it became more and more of a problem. And this was really the first opioid epidemic. In fact, it's estimated that by 1900, there were about 1% of all the people in America were addicted to opioids, in particular through patent medicines with children. So it was used for colic, and a lot of babies were given it to soothe their stomach, which of course it does, but then they became dependent on it, so when the opium would wear off, then they would go into withdrawal and they would start crying, and so the parents would give them more. It became more and more abused and became such a problem that in 1916 the Harrison Act was passed, which made it only legal to use opioids by a doctor's prescription. So after the Harrison Act was enacted, it was only possible to get opioids through a doctor's prescription. And this really did work to cut down on the amount of use and abuse. The second opioid epidemic really didn't start until the Vietnam War. By then, the young generation had forgotten all about opioids being abused back in the 1900s. And so they were not aware of just how dangerous opioids can be. A good friend of mine, Dr. Rick Blondell, was the first one to introduce me to the concept of generational forgetting. And this is the idea that what tends to happen in substance abuse is a drug comes on the market and it seems to be really good, and people use it, and then they start abusing it, and before you know it, there's been a lot of abuse, and eventually the abuse gets worse and worse and worse until things have to happen and change, and then everybody realizes just how bad it is, and so they stop using it. But usually when people stop using that drug, they just switch to another. So we saw that with the opioids. We also saw that with amphetamines that were invented in the 1940s that everybody thought was great, and World War II pilots were using it, and it became a very popular drug for weight loss and for people to use to give them energy in the 50s and 60s, but then everybody realized they were getting addicted to it, and so it went down. It sort of got replaced by Valium, which came on the market as a great drug, as this incredible thing. Mother's Little Helper, the Rolling Stones even wrote a song about it. But after a while, it became incredibly obvious that it was a really dangerous drug and that people were addicted to it and having horrible withdrawal. Of course, that got replaced by Xanax in the 1980s. And then that became a problem. And then cocaine, which had been a problem back in the 1920s, came on the market. But I'm jumping ahead a little. So the second opioid epidemic was in the 60s and 70s when guys started coming back from Southeast Asia, and a number of them had been abusing and using heroin. And when they came back, it was a problem enough that the government decided to set up methadone clinics. Methadone was a pretty controversial treatment at the time, but something had to be done because it was really hard to get people to stop using heroin. And so the methadone helped, and that kind of crisis went down. And most people, if I talk to patients who are in their 50s and 60s, I often ask them, so what drugs have you used? And they often say, oh, I've used them all. And then I say, did you use heroin? And they say, oh, no, I'm not that stupid. So they learned that lesson that they should never use heroin. But unfortunately, that lesson never got learned by the people in the 90s, the younger kids, and that was when the third opioid epidemic started. So it kind of started because of the cocaine epidemic in the 1980s. That became the very popular drug. NFL players were using it and actors, and everybody thought, oh, it's not even addictive. It's great. It gives you energy. It's so much fun. Well, by the time 5 or 10 years had passed, we knew it was actually a very dangerous drug, and crack had come on the market as a purified form. And the cocaine Colombian cartel were able to bring cocaine in incredibly powerfully in the 90 to 95% range. But that started going down a little bit in the 90s. But heroin then came on the market. They had learned in Colombia how to grow poppies and produce heroin that was now in the 95% range. So it came in as this white powder, and the young kids in the 90s started using it. In fact, I even heard that the Colombians were saying to dealers you had to take 19 kilos of cocaine and 1 kilo of heroin. They knew that if they could get kids using heroin, they'd get physically dependent on it, and that would be a great market for them. And that's what happened. I remember in the 90s, we were starting to see here in Richmond stories of many, many overdoses because kids were switching from the cocaine to the heroin. What had been $100 a day snorting this white powder, they could start off with $10 a day with heroin, and it just seemed like an obvious thing. It turns out that if heroin's less than 15% pure, you kind of have to use it with a needle. It just clogs up your nose and they can't do it. But when the Colombians were bringing in this incredibly pure heroin, you could snort it. So that became a low barrier for people to try. And again, with this generational forgetting, people had no idea of just how dangerous it was. So that's what started happening. At the same time, the pharmaceutical companies started producing really powerful drugs, particularly Oxycontin. So that came on the market. Oxycodone is a powerful painkiller, and it was being used quite a lot for chronic pain. And Purdue Pharma came out with a version of that called Oxycontin that was a 12-hour drug. And it was supposed to last as a nice, steady, even level. But it turns out it actually didn't. It went up quite high, and then it started drifting down over the day. And so a lot of doctors started prescribing it because it seemed like a great treatment for chronic pain. It became just part of the medical treatment practice to treat pain more seriously. And it even became called the fifth vital sign, where doctors were encouraged to treat pain. The messages came out from smart people who were trying to educate doctors that there was no ceiling. You could keep going higher and higher, and you could just keep going, and patients would have their pain treated. The problem is people started using lots and lots of the new drug Oxycontin. I'll never forget one of my patients who had had an alcohol problem in the past, and he was now on oxycodone, and he was using 5 milligrams 4 times a day, so 20 milligrams a day. So I put him on Oxycontin because it was new, and I thought it maybe is a good treatment for him. And he started at 10 milligrams twice a day, so the same dose, but within 2 weeks he said, I just need more. And so very quickly he was up to 40 milligrams a day. So within 2 weeks he'd needed to use double. And what ended up happening was people then started saying that they need 3 times a day. So sales of Oxycontin and other drugs that came on the market just went through the roof, and billions of dollars of sales. And so doctors started getting really convinced that the way to treat chronic pain was through these pain meds. And their pain meds became everywhere. They became abused really badly. It was just a horrible time in the late 90s and the early 2000s. There were mostly well-meaning doctors prescribing these drugs because patients were coming in chronic pain. And unfortunately, chronic pain patients usually stay on their drug. But there were also some total scam doctors and what we even call pill mills. So there were very corrupt doctors who were getting very rich. There was just so much money to be made with these new drugs. And it turns out what a pill mill is when the doctor can prescribe the drug and then also sell it to the patient at the same time. So you had a lot of people making an awful lot of money. One Oxycontin, 80 milligrams, was going for $80, and many patients were on 4 of these a day, so really high doses, like 80 milligrams 4 times a day is just a huge dose, and so they could make ridiculous amounts of money. In fact, I'll remember talking to a pharmacist in West Virginia, and he said, I don't know if you know, Doc, what's going on out here, but there are flights going from here in West Virginia down to Florida every day, and patients go down there and they go and hit up 4 or 5 different pill mills, and they come back on the flight that day with just bags and bags of drugs, and they can make thousands and thousands of dollars every day. So that's the kind of thing that was going on. The drug companies were making a lot of money, the scam doctors were making a lot, patients were selling it, and it just has wrought incredible destruction to many, many towns all over the country. By now, the Mexican drug cartel, and it's well outlined in the book Dreamland, had really developed very sophisticated distribution for heroin to come into the States and was really available at very, very cheap prices all over the country. Doctors in the medical system started reacting and realizing that the number of opioid prescriptions just went up like this, and the deaths from opioids went up just in parallel with it. And so a lot of pressure started becoming put onto doctors to not prescribe as much, and a lot of education went out there, and that has really worked incredibly well. So the number of new prescriptions for opioids has gone down quite nicely. Unfortunately, that meant that there's less legal opioids around, and so there was a much higher market for the morphine, the heroin that was coming in from Mexico and from other places. And then, to make it worse, fentanyl came out. Fentanyl, of course, is an incredibly powerful opioid that was originally developed as a pharmaceutical, but it turns out that fentanyl is very easy to be made. You don't have to use poppies. You can just make it with chemicals in a lab, and you can make it for probably 1/10 of the price or even less than that, and it's very powerful. Fentanyl, by its nature, is so powerful that it causes so many drug overdoses, and that's really what's happening now. In fact, fentanyl has become so pervasive now that every time we see a patient and we ask them what drugs they're taking, if they say heroin, we pretty much know it's pure fentanyl. This started changing about 2 or 3 years ago, where people thought they were using heroin, but what they were actually using was fentanyl. We've even seen fentanyl being pressed into pills so that when people think they're buying oxycodone or hydrocodone or some other pharmaceutical pill, it's actually fentanyl. And fentanyl has just got such a high fatality rate that even though the number of people using opioids has actually started going down, the death rate from fentanyl has gone up And in fact, here we are in January of 2021. In 2020, the death rate from opioid overdose was about 20% higher even than the previous year, which was a record. It's a horrible problem. In fact, I can tell you that I just talked with a mother last week who were called up to tell me that her son, who we'd treated 5 or 6 years ago and had done quite well but had relapsed, had now died, and I'm sure it was a fentanyl overdose. In fact, here in Chesterfield County last weekend there were 6 overdoses in one day, which almost certainly was a batch of fentanyl that was much stronger than the people were used to. So that's where we are now. Fentanyl is out there and is almost the only opioid that's being abused, and it's still causing a huge number of overdoses. It's very available, it's very cheap, and I hate to say it, I don't think it's going away anytime soon. The good news is that society in general is accepting the disease of addiction a lot more. People are more forgiving and more understanding that patients who are suffering from this have a disease that they don't really want to have. There's a lot more treatment available. People can get onto Naltrexone, they can get onto Methadone, they can get onto Suboxone, and I'll talk about those in other videos. The criminal justice system is also doing a much, much better job of introducing people to treatment and to recovery, and often using carrots and sticks to motivate people to get out of jail by getting into recovery and staying in recovery. So we all need to be paying attention. We all need to accept this is a disease and help the people who are suffering from it. And hopefully over time we can get people into treatment as quickly as possible. Fentanyl is just so dangerous that there is really no good reason to not get into treatment as soon as possible. I hope you found this information helpful. If you have, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, or you can email me at drcoleman@thecolemaninstitute.com. I'd love to hear some comments, and if you have any questions or future topics, I'd be more than happy to bring those up. Please subscribe to this channel and tell your friends, and feel free to share a link to it. Thank you.